Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Heidi Shue, President of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to our foreign policy panel discussion focused on 50 years of nuclear crisis, from Cuba to Iran. This program marks the beginning of the 5th season of World Affairs Today, the Council's weekly international affairs television program. Each Sunday morning, World Affairs Today is broadcast on MHC Worldview Television to 42 million households across America. The program is also made available on the Council's YouTube channel after broadcast. Together, these programs have been watched by hundreds of thousands of individuals interested in international affairs and global education. To our audience at home, I want to say that we hope that you enjoy these programs and find their subjects informative and thought-provoking. The Council seeks to engage Americans in increased participation in and understanding of the major global issues of our time. Through programs such as these and through a robust schools program, we engage with tens of thousands of adults and students each year. Our efforts with high school teachers and students help provide a global education to students in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area and beyond, through professional development workshops, leadership academies, and international travel, and more. With these programs, we seek to fill the global education gap that exists in our nation's classrooms today. If you would like to support our programs or have comments or questions, we'd like to hear from you. Our website is www.worldaffairsdc.org, and our phone number appears at the bottom of your television screen. The Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization and is classified a 501c3 by the Internal Revenue Service, so gifts are tax deductible from federal income taxes. Again, thank you for joining us today. Those of you who are with us at the University Club here in Washington, D.C., and those of you who are viewing from home. Now let us move on to our program. We welcome to the program 3 individuals well-versed in nuclear politics and in the crises that we have experienced in the past 50 years since those 13 days in October 1962. Dr. Barry Blechman is co-founder of and currently distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and focuses on nuclear disarmament issues. He has written extensively on national security issues and co-chaired the Iran Study Group at the U.S. Institute of Peace, producing the report, Engagement, Coercion, and Iran's Nuclear Challenge. Ambassador Robert Joseph is a senior scholar at the National Institute for Public Policy and professor at Missouri State University. A former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, he brokered the 2003 agreement with Libya, under which Libya gave up their weapons of mass destruction programs. Dr. Susan Cook is a consultant on policy issues regarding arms reduction and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and a distinguished research fellow at the National Defense University here in Washington. She will moderate the program. We are all looking forward to your remarks, and thank you for being with us today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. Dr. Cook?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will try and give a brief overview of the last 50 years, 50 years in 5 minutes. Of course, of the nuclear crisis we have faced, the Cuban Missile Crisis was by far the most acute and came the closest to catastrophe. But it was not the only one. There have been several other nuclear crises known more or less well since 1962. Through luck, skill, and/or providence, none has yet yielded catastrophe. Some have even provided an impetus to real progress, The first example of that is indeed the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a distinct turning point in the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The fact that we came so close to nuclear war and that the US and Soviet leaders had no direct means of communication led directly and in a very few months to the first real arms control agreement, the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which banned above-ground nuclear testing, and the hotline, establishing a very rudimentary communications link between the White House and the Kremlin. Not a lot, perhaps, but it started a process and was a major change. It started a real change in the relationship, one leading over time to progressively deeper arms reductions. At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States had over 25,000 nuclear warheads. The number peaked at 31,000 5 years later in 1967 and has declined steadily ever since. So that by 2009, the last year for which data are available, we had 5,000 nuclear warheads, which if I count right, is about an 85% reduction. 30 years later, in December 1991, we faced another kind of potential nuclear crisis, one of the loss of control of nuclear warheads. There was great fear that with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, nuclear control would dissolve as well. To confront that danger, the United States Congress passed the cooperative threat reduction, the legislation that led to the cooperative threat reduction, or non-Lugar program, to help reduce and secure Soviet nuclear weapons, material, and delivery vehicles. The program not only helped to avoid nuclear chaos, but led to previously unimaginable cooperation in very sensitive areas between the United States and Russia and other former Soviet republics. And it still exists today, 20 years on. In 1995, yet another kind of nuclear crisis, one of the potential for accident. The Russian military mistook a sounding rocket launched from Norway to be a US nuclear submarine missile. And we are told Russia came very close to responding. Luckily, they waited. The sounding rocket changed its trajectory, moving away from Russian territory, and crisis was averted. Still another form of nuclear crisis a few years later, 1999, Indian and Pakistani troops clashed in the Kargil crisis, the first direct military confrontation between nuclear-armed adversaries. The fear of nuclear escalation led the United States to intervene and successfully diffuse the crisis. But it's difficult to say that any long-term lessons have been learned. Kargil was not the turning point in Indian-Pakistani relations that Cuba appeared to have been between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now we face new challenges and looming crises. North Korea has tested 2 nuclear weapons in 2006 and 2009, and just some days ago launched a space launch satellite into orbit that appears to be at least a major milestone on the way to North Korea having long-range missile capability that could threaten the United States. Iran appears to be working steadily, relentlessly toward nuclear capability. The question is whether the previous pattern will hold of positive or at least neutral results from nuclear crisis. Or are we now facing a new form of nuclear danger beyond any previously seen? Our 2 panelists will offer different perspectives on the last half-century of nuclear crises. Barry Blechman will open with an overview discussion of the trends of the last 5 years, And then Ambassador Bob Joseph will follow with a discussion of the specific issue of Libya's nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you all for coming to listen to us. I actually would retitle the session. I'd call it 50 Years of Progress Toward Reducing Nuclear Dangers. As Susan said, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call for at least the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and there's been a pretty substantial progress toward containing the risk of nuclear war, whether by accident or by deliberate intent, ever since. There have been close calls during these 50 years, and there are serious threats on the horizon which could change this picture. But what I'd like to do is outline the progress that's been made and then talk about the close calls and the current dangers. First, we have to remember that at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, government officials and outside experts agreed that nuclear weapons were likely to proliferate to a large number of countries. The usual prediction was that by the end of the century, that is the last century, there would be 25 to 30 nuclear weapon states. Of course, there are now 9. Iran, if it acquired weapons, would be only the 10th. So substantial progress in containing the spread of nuclear weapons. Secondly, as Susan pointed out, the US and Soviet, now Russian nuclear arsenals have come down substantially in number. So have the French and British nuclear arsenals from their peaks. We see a different picture in Asia, where a number of states are continuing to build up the size of their nuclear forces, and I'll come back to that at the end, toward the end of my presentation. The question is, well, why has there been this success? It wasn't just the fears that were the result of the Cuban crisis. The first factor, and I think this will surprise Bob, is the U.S. leadership in providing security guarantees to many countries around the world. Security guarantees which include a nuclear component but are much broader in terms of the diplomatic and military instruments we use to assure these countries that their security is protected. And this enabled them to decide not to develop nuclear weapons on their own. So I would give first credit to the very positive role the U.S. has played throughout these 50 years. Secondly, the U.S. and the Soviet Union and other states have taken pragmatic steps to negotiate agreements which both contain or reduce the risk of accidental or inadvertent war, and which reduce the size of nuclear arsenals. These have sometimes taken the form of treaties, sometimes they've taken the form of reciprocal unilateral measures, but there's been a whole series of agreements to establish communications protocols, to establish rules of the road for military activity, to require pre-notification of missile flight tests, for example, pragmatic measures which help to avoid accidents. Thirdly, a robust non-proliferation regime was established, beginning with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was concluded in 1968. The negotiations began a few years before then. Interestingly, not all nuclear weapon states agreed to the treaty initially. Both France and China stayed out of the treaty, and they both had tested nuclear weapons at that point. But over time, the treaty has gained increasing adherence from nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, with a few key exceptions, Israel, India, and Pakistan being the most important, obviously, and North Korea at this point. The treaty essentially established a contract where over 180 states have pledged that they will never develop nuclear weapons. And in exchange, the nuclear weapon states, the 5 who have signed the treaty, have in a carefully hedged statement said that they would work toward eliminate their nuclear weapons and also provide means for non-nuclear weapon states to utilize nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. This is done under supervision. Declared nuclear facilities are monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which provides good assurance that, for the most part, that these facilities are not being used to develop nuclear weapons. And there have been some problems here, which I'll come to. Supplementing the treaty and the IAEA's inspections are, very importantly, the regimes that supplier nations have reached that limit exports of equipment and materials which could be used in nuclear weapons programs. And these have probably been just as important as the first two in terms of limiting access to key elements necessary for bomb making, nuclear weapons making. And then finally, why has there been progress? Well, just the passage of time without nuclear use, and even with only very few nuclear threats, has developed, there's a taboo has developed against nuclear weapons, which relegates nuclear weapons further and further into the corner of nations' thinking and of national policies. And this taboo is something which affects the way that governments think of their security and of their options in those cases when their security might be threatened. Now, I don't want to paint an overly optimistic picture. There's been close calls during these 50 years. There have been many incidents and technical accidents or malfunctions when we had bombers with nuclear weapons on them actually in flight on a constant basis. There were weapons, there were crashes, and weapons fortunately did not explode but were lost. There have been cases where training tapes have entered into a system that provided mistaken warning of nuclear attacks. There's been mistakes made by radars which misinterpreted flights of birds and so forth. So there's certainly been potential accidents, but fortunately none have come to fruition, or none have resulted in a nuclear detonation. There have also been points in crises in which nuclear weapons might have been used. As Susan mentioned, the Cuba, we now know that the Russian commander in Cuba had authority to use nuclear weapons if he was under attack or thought he was under attack. There was a case with this Russian submarine which might have utilized a torpedo with a nuclear warhead. In 1973, the U.S. placed its nuclear forces on alert to signal to the Soviet Union, which was threatening to intervene in the Middle East. against Israel to threaten that we would not tolerate this. At the time, the president, it was the height of the Watergate crisis, and President Nixon, we now know, was in the living quarters of the White House, drunk. And General Haig, who was chief of staff at the time, served his country very well by shuttling between the Situation Room, where Secretary Kissinger, Secretary Schlesinger, and the others were meeting, shuttling between them and the living quarters and assuring the president that all was well and was being managed properly. Because the last thing they wanted was the president to, in his condition at the time. There was a time, as Susan mentioned, with the Norwegian sounding rocket when Boris Yeltsin, who was always drunk, could easily have made a terrible mistake. So there are problems. There could have been problems. Certainly Cargill was another, which Susan mentioned, another case in which crisis easily could have led to nuclear use. And the problem here is the problems with deterrence. And it's a problem which will always be with us as long as there are nuclear weapons. We believe that a state with nuclear weapons will not attack another state with nuclear weapons, or a state protected by the assurances of a nuclear weapon state, because it is deterred because it fears that if it attacks, the state it attack will retaliate, and with devastating consequences for itself. But deterrence is, it's not a law of physics. It's not like gravity. It's a logical, it's something we can understand logically, but there's nothing which makes it work automatically. To deter someone, you have to be able to communicate clearly with them. You have to understand what they value, threaten what it is they value. The person you're threatening, the decision maker, needs to be rational, needs to be not under the influence of other substances, and needs to take your threat seriously and credibly. And so far, so far so good. In some future crisis, perhaps it won't be work as well. So let me close by just mentioning the crises the prospective crises that we face. The U.S. and Russia are building down their nuclear forces. This might change, but so far we've been doing that. But in Asia, there's an incipient nuclear arms race. Pakistan is acquiring nuclear materials and building nuclear weapons at a very rapid rate. It sees itself threatened by India. India is building up its arsenal, partly in response to Pakistan, but also because India sees itself in a rivalry with China. China is building up its nuclear arsenal. So these arsenals are small. They're an order of magnitude smaller than the US and Russian arsenals even at this point, but they are building up. It's this kind of slow motion arms race, but it's one that could easily accelerate. And secondly, we have the problem of Iran. If Iran, North Korea became the 9th nuclear power. It withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and threw out the IAEA inspectors and developed and tested a nuclear weapon. Iran is clearly accumulating nuclear materials in excess of the requirements of its peaceful nuclear infrastructure. It's conducting other kinds of experiments which threaten us. If Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, becoming the 10th nuclear weapon state, it would be a devastating blow to the proliferation regime and could easily have multiplier effects on other countries in the region and even other states who might begin to see that the nuclear taboo isn't that strong, and perhaps we all need to acquire nuclear weapons to assure our security. I'm sorry I've exceeded my time, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Barry. Thanks very much. Bob?
Susan, thank you. Barry, it's good to see you again and participate in another debate with you. Let me first begin by thanking the World Affairs Council for inviting me to participate tonight in this discussion. Sitting in between Susan and Barry, it's going to be hard for me to contain my optimism, but I'll try. As Susan mentioned, I am going to talk about Libya and the lessons learned from the Libyan experience, which was, I think, a significant non- or counterproliferation success story, and also, as Susan would say, a case study of a near nuclear crisis turning into an opportunity. What I'd like to do is just take a minute or two and talk about the chronology of events, and then another minute or two and talk about motivations on the part of Libya, because I think both of those are important for understanding lessons learned. And it's really the lessons learned that I want to concentrate on, or at least some of the lessons learned, those that I think have applicability to emerging nuclear crises, particularly in Iran and North Korea. In terms of the chronology, just very, very briefly, the Libyans came to us through British intelligence. This was Saif Gaddafi, part-time living in London, part-time going to school at one of my alma maters, the London School of Economics, now living a different lifestyle. He said, we want to talk to the Americans. This again in March of 2003, when we're flowing hundreds of thousands of forces to Iraq to enforce Security Council resolutions on WMD. He said, we want to clear the air about WMD programs in Libya. George Tenet, the director of the CIA, had testified recently about growing concerns with regard to Libyan programs. The next significant date is October of 2003, a number of months later, when the Libyans agreed to allow small teams, US and UK intelligence teams, to come into country, to look at their program, to talk to their scientists, their technicians, their military officers. Why did they do this? Quite simply, they did this because days before, we had intercepted a ship, the BBC China, which was carrying thousands of centrifuge parts from Malaysia, an AQ Khan facility. He was actually producing his own centrifuge parts, and the shipment was on its way to Libya. The US and UK had penetrated that network. We had actionable intelligence. We diverted the ship to Italy. We took photographs of the cargo. We presented those to the Libyans, and the game was up, as they say, and the Libyans allowed us to come in. The third date was mid-December 2003, when we had a policy discussion, the first and only policy discussion at the time, with the Libyans, in which we made very clear to the Libyans that if they wanted to resolve this issue, they had to make a public statement that they had a nuclear weapons program and that they had chemical weapons, and that they were abandoning these programs. Abandonment meant that we would come over and we would remove these programs, hundreds of tons of nuclear equipment. We would also remove the longer range missiles that Libya had, and we would crush all of the chemical munitions. The chemical agent, was another story, and that would take more time to eliminate. Finally, in March of 2004, a ship, the Industrial Challenger, sailed from Libya with all of this equipment, and the crisis, or the impending crisis, was resolved. Motivations, again, very, very briefly. Sanctions had had an impact on Libyan calculations, no question about it. Also, no question that sanctions alone would not have gotten the Libyans to take the decision that they took. There's just no question about it. Libyans wanted to be a more normal country, believe it or not. Colonel Gaddafi was concerned about his legacy, or at least his sons were concerned about his legacy, and wanted to change. Third, the Libyans wanted to work with us on combating terrorism. They were very concerned about extremist Islam and wanted to join forces with us because they saw themselves vulnerable to those forces. Fourth, the program had been disrupted, as I mentioned. We had intercepted this shipment from AQCON. AQCON was the lifeline for the Libyan program. Without AQCON, and this is the time that we started to take down the AQCON network, without that network, the Libyan program would not progress. And finally, and most important, the Libyans did not want to be Iraq. Saddam Hussein had been pulled from the spider hole 3 days before our policy discussion with the Libyans in London. No question, Gaddafi did not want to be that fellow in the spider hole. They did not want to be next on the target list, and they thought they were going to be. So those are the motivations. What about the lessons learned? I've written the case study on this, and I come up with 10 different lessons learned from this experience. Let me just, because of the time, focus on 3 of them. The first is that in order to be successful in non-proliferation, and I would argue in any nuclear crisis, the United States has to be perceived as serious. We have to be perceived as serious by our allies. We have to be perceived as serious by our adversaries. There's no question that in March of 2003, we were seen as serious about non-encounter proliferation. No question at all. This was at the top of the President's priority list. He had undertaken a number of international initiatives, including in the context of the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program through the G8 Global Partnership, and in May of 2003 had announced the Proliferation Security Initiative, which was dedicated to disrupting the trade in proliferation materials. We were perceived as serious at that time, and that had an impact on how the Libyan leadership responded. Second, the need for a comprehensive strategy for dealing with these threats, and the use of all of the tools that are available to us. In the Libyan case, I mentioned sanctions. We did use the economic tool, and we used it to good effect. I mentioned intelligence. We used that tool to great effect with the Libyans. When we provided the Libyans with evidence of their nuclear program, which they had denied, you could see on their faces that they were well beyond impressed with the ability of the U.S. and U.K. intelligence services. Diplomacy. We did use diplomacy with Libya, but it was quite unconventional diplomacy. It wasn't State Department diplomacy. It was diplomacy that was run out of the White House. In fact, when we had our policy discussions in London, we didn't tell the State Department that we were going to have them because we thought it would leak in 10 minutes. We didn't tell the Pentagon either because it would leak in 5 minutes. And there was a sense, and there was a belief that any leak would put Gaddafi in a position in which he couldn't make the type of concessions that we were seeking, that he couldn't give up the program if this leaked and the Arab press picked up on it. I mentioned interdiction, another tool. I mentioned the use of force, or the perceived use of force as another tool. All of these tools were important, but I think what was even more important was our ability to apply these tools in the context of, as I mentioned, a comprehensive strategy. This is something that we had worked on. It is something that we had published in late 2002, the first national strategy for dealing with proliferation threats. When I entered the White House in January of 2001, there was one document that was left on my desk. Most documents are packed up and sent off to what's going to become the presidential library. It's common practice. This one document was the Clinton administration's presidential guidance on non-proliferation. And it had 3 components. export controls, cooperative threat reduction, and strengthening the NPT regime. All important things to do. But what we said we needed to do was add another pillar for the strategy, which dealt with protection, because we would not always be successful in preventing proliferation. We knew that with regard to North Korea. When we came into office, we were greeted with a recently published, unclassified report, or assessment rather, that North Korea had enough plutonium for 2 nuclear weapons. We knew we weren't going to always be successful, so we had to protect, and we had to protect not only the United States, but our allies from these new threats. And part of that was missile defense, which led us to get out of the ABM treaty. Part of it was better medical countermeasures because of the growing threat of biological terrorism or the use of biological agents by hostile states. In fact, that was, when I entered the White House, at least what I considered to be the greatest threat for which we were most unprepared. And we added a third pillar because we thought we would not always be successful in protecting, and that was response. It's become the consequence management, that horrible bureaucratic term. But it's more than consequence management. It's also forensics and other things. But the idea here is clear, and that is we need a strategy. We need a comprehensive strategy bringing together all of these tools. And finally, I would note a third lesson learned, and that lesson is the need to insist on a strategic decision on the part of the other country. In the Libyan case, we told ourselves that we weren't going to be in a situation again, such as we were finding out with Iran. The Libyans were not going to be allowed to simply put their nuclear equipment in the closet for a while, and then a year later, or 2 years later, or 3 years later, open up the closet and say, okay, we're now going to have a peaceful nuclear program, just like Iran. That wasn't going to happen. So we needed to be sure that the hostile country, that the adversary, made the strategic decision to give up the weapons of mass destruction in its country. And how do you know when they do that? Well, it's kind of like many other things. You know it when you see it. We knew it with Libya when our intelligence teams that were over there for a second visit were leaving. They were at the airport, and up raced the Libyans with shopping bags full of diagrams of a nuclear warhead. We didn't know they had them. But when that happened, we kind of said, even the most skeptical people in the White House that were wise to this said, I think they've made that strategic decision. I am out of time, so let me stop there. Maybe we can pursue, how these lessons learned have been applied or have not been applied in other cases, such as Iran and North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. I'm going to start off briefly our question and answer session with what I know is a very unfair question. You've both done a superb job in giving us a sense of the complexity of the issues involved in our nuclear history over the last half century. So I'm going to ask for a simple answer. That is it possible to identify one or two most important reasons why we have avoided nuclear catastrophe over these many years? And if so, what are the implications for current U.S. and allied policy?
Well, I guess I'd answer that by saying the most important reason has been the U.S. leadership in establishing a relatively secure world order that through our security guarantees in Europe and in East Asia and to implied guarantees in the Middle East, we have greatly reduced the incentives for countries to acquire nuclear weapons and thereby bounded the problem such that it could be dealt with, carefully through bilateral relationships.
Well, I would like to agree with Barry on this point. I think U.S. leadership is very important. I come at these issues from a non-proliferation or counter-proliferation perspective, and I think that leadership in establishing a relatively secure world order has been key. Our commitments to our allies and the demonstration of resolve to our potential adversaries has made a major contribution. I would also add that it's the commitment of resources as well to this issue. Everything from non-Lugar, which Susan is most expert on, and I mentioned the G8 effort, PSI, I mentioned that, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, a number of initiatives to bring international partners together to protect sensitive materials, to keep those materials out of the hands of state proliferators or terrorists, and to get other countries involved in the non-proliferation efforts that are so essential to ensuring a relatively secure world order.
Thank you both. For the future, and by the future I mean is probably the here and now, and over the next 5, possibly 10 years, what do you think is the source of the greatest nuclear danger facing the United States, facing the world? And what can we do to avert or mitigate it? Again, Barry?
The greatest nuclear danger, I think, is Pakistan and the risks associated with their large and growing stock of nuclear materials and nuclear weapons. And the risks are, of course, the possibility of that these materials or weapons might be seized by the many extremists, one of the many extremist groups which bedevil that poor country, or that the country could just devolve into civil conflict and these materials find their way to people who would not follow the logic of deterrence and perhaps use them against us. So I'd put that as the number one problem.
Well, once again, I agree with Barry. I mean, Pakistan is everybody's worst instant nuclear nightmare, given that there are lots of terrorists and lots of nuclear weapons and a political situation that is far from stable in the long term. In terms of what we can do about it, well, I mean, we have provided some capabilities, but we are restricted in terms of what we can do with Pakistan to ensure the security of their nuclear force by our obligations under the NPT. We can also take those actions that will help protect against the worst case. And the worst case may not be sort of far off, and that is the loss of a nuclear weapon or more than one nuclear weapon in Pakistan. The development of a nuclear detection architecture, the ability to interdict loose nukes. We need to take those measures that will protect the United States and our allies from this threat. But Pakistan's not the only threat that we face in the nuclear arena. I mentioned that Russia is building up and China is building up, and our policy, going back to the days of the Kennedy administration, in fact, it was President Kennedy who said, we will have a nuclear posture that is second to none. And that was important for deterrence. It was important for extended deterrence with our allies. I believe, Barry may disagree with me, Susan may disagree with me, that we are very close to that outcome. The Russians, as I say, are on the trajectory to match us on the strategic side in terms of operational warheads and in terms of delivery systems. Not now, not today, but 10 years from now. And they've made this very, very clear. You don't find the Russian president talking very often about going to zero, but you do find him quite often appearing before the media to extol the virtues of Russian nuclear capabilities, whether it's a new submarine or a new bomber or a new missile that's being launched. The Russians are moving up. The Chinese are moving up. They're way below us. They're way below us. I don't believe they're going to try to match us unless we go down to real low levels. But they're going up. They're going up in order to be able to deny the United States access to the Asia-Pacific area. And the nuclear is one component of a broader set of capabilities, including cyber, including anti-space, including anti-ship ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, including more sophisticated submarines, that will keep us out. And I think we need to we need to be very clear to ourselves about the value of nuclear weapons, and I think we're losing that. All we talk about is how low can we go. And with every new sort of ceiling that we set, it becomes, it becomes, well, where can we go next? Even if they're unilateral steps. And we're at that point where overall Russian nuclear capabilities are much greater than ours, if you include the so-called non-strategic nuclear warheads. Now there's a thought, non-strategic nuclear warheads. Can you imagine what one of our allies, whether in Asia or whether in Europe, would say about a nuclear weapon going off in Japan or let's say in Poland? It'd be pretty darn strategic. The notion of non-strategic is a artifact from the arms control process. And there were reasons that we divided up strategic and non-strategic, but they weren't sort of sound reasons of strategy. They were reasons of convenience for arriving at an arms control agreement of some sort.
If I just break this
Trying to lie
new harmony here. The Russians are putting greater stress on nuclear forces in their doctrine and in their plans and in their budgets because they're weak. They're weak in conventional military capabilities. They don't have a prayer of matching the incredible capabilities of our conventional military forces. Bob says the Russians will build up to the start limits. So we're above the start limits and need to build down to them. To me, that's the case for a new agreement, which brings us both to a lower level. Let them not build up as much. I'm sure they could use the money for many other things. And we could build down further and save funds from what is, in fact, a quite vibrant modernization program of our own. We are building new strategic submarines and missiles to go with them. We are building a new bomber, which will be nuclear capable at some point. We're building new fighters, which will be capable of carrying tactical nuclear weapons. So it's not a kind of one-sided. I agree, the Russians put more emphasis and probably more money in it than we are now, but it's not a one-sided competition at this point.
I would just, for the record, say it's not Bob who says the Russians are building up. It's President Putin who says the Russians are building up, and the defense minister of Russia who says they're building up. And it's the facts. They are building up. yes, it is in part out of weakness, conventional weakness. No country on earth can match us conventionally. But that's only part of the story.
Well, we could go on for a while on this issue, but it would be good to hear from you.
My question is, why have we not espoused no first use? And in part of that question, I go back not just 50 years, but 67 years when the crisis began, and I was part of the mobilization for invading Japan. And the justification for our first use at that time was that it saved hundreds of thousands of lives that otherwise would have been lost in that invasion. There was a similar symposium at the Carnegie Institute about a year ago, and a Japanese official was part of the panel, and I had the opportunity to ask him, did we really need to use first those weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or would the invasion not have been necessary for other reasons? I did not get an answer. All he said was he lost his uncle in the submarine. The real question is, should we advocate that the United States clearly would not, under any circumstances, first use? And if so, how do we square it with what, in fact, we did 67 years ago?
Well, there's been research published in the last few years which suggests that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not the decisive elements in ending the war. The decision to do so, to use them, was certainly understandable, but research into the diaries of senior Japanese leaders and just the timing of the meetings of the Japanese suggests the Hiroshima bombing was not decisive, and neither Nagasaki. After Hiroshima, there was a question of whether the Supreme Council should meet, and the decision was not to meet. After all, the Japanese had already lost more than 60 cities before Hiroshima, virtually completely destroyed. More people were killed in the firebombing in Tokyo than by the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. And that what caused the Japanese to decide to surrender was the entry of the Russians into the war. They had been trying to persuade the Russians to mediate a settlement with the Western powers, which would be more favorable to their terms, and the Russians not only refused to do that, but declared war, and its Russian forces were entering Manchuria and the northern islands. And at that point, the Supreme Council met and was meeting, discussing the surrender at the time of the Nagasaki bomb. So the first use was understandable why the decision was made, but in fact, in retrospect, was not necessary.
You know, the last time I was asked the question that was posed about the use of two weapons against Japan, I was in the State Department, and I was on the record, and I made the argument that the use against Nagasaki and Hiroshima did save not only hundreds of thousands of American and British lives, but also likely millions of Japanese lives. I mean, just look at the battle over Okinawa, and look at the horrendous destruction of life on both sides, but particularly the loss of life on the Japanese side. I don't subscribe to sort of, I'll call it revisionist history. I think it was a necessary decision, and I think it did clearly hasten the end of the war. As to sort of today, the contemporary issue of no first use, I don't put much stock in policy declarations. We know that the Soviet Union had a no first use policy. They don't anymore, Russia doesn't anymore, but they did as the Soviet Union. And we also know that, and we should have known this before, it didn't have any meaning. When we did get access to Russian war plans or Soviet war plans, they were planning on the first day, 600 nuclear detonations in Western Europe. There's a no first use policy for you. 600. Now you can say, well, it was only a plan, and they wouldn't have executed the plan. But maybe they would have. It was the plan. It was the plan, and it certainly did contradict their no first use policy statement.
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford. Dr. Blechman, in his prepared remarks, mentioned that there was a time we expected a number of additional countries to go nuclear that didn't. And I find myself thinking of South Africa and Taiwan, which were both working behind the scenes with Israel, and Argentina and Brazil. Would you tell some of the story behind these countries choosing not to go fully nuclear?
Certainly. And we often, I'm glad you raised that, because we often forget that countries have turned away. Bob mentioned, Susan perhaps mentioned, when the three successor nations to the Soviet Union willingly gave up their nuclear arsenals. Is a great accomplishment of the Clinton administration, I'd say, in persuading them to do so. Argentina and Brazil is probably the most interesting case, because here was two countries with advanced industrial capabilities, both with civilian programs, which stepped back from an incipient nuclear arms race. They had a change of government, which was a very important part of it, and began a confidence-building, reciprocal confidence-building measures, and moved back from their weapons programs. South Africa, I think, is a kind of sui generis case. But there are many other countries who have given up nuclear programs because of the U.S. security guarantees, countries which were examining possibilities in the 1960s and then stepped back from the program.
Well, it leaves me to thank our two panelists and for a very illuminating, useful discussion, the World Affairs Council for inviting us, and particularly all of you for your interest and attention. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.